This is the Comics Alternative, episode 277, reviews of Von Spatz, Skyward, #1, and Resident Alien and Alien in New York, #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two PhDs, or in my case, almost there, talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Paul and I are going to be discussing 3 recent releases. We're going to begin with Anna Haifisch's Von Spatz. After that, we're going to look at Skyward, #1, written by Joe Henderson with art by Lee Garbett. And then after that, we're going to look at the first issue of the latest narrative arc in the Resident Alien series. Resident Alien and Alien in New York, written by Peter Hogan and with art by Steve Parkhouse. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But you know, occasionally you may find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right. You got to be paying attention to catch all those wonderful discounts. One of the ways that you can do that is that DCBS has these great bundles. And Derek, I don't know about you, but I took advantage of the 50% off that you can get on a whole bundle of Young Animal titles or Vertigo titles or DC Kids titles. And so those bundles are a fantastic way to get 45, many of them 50% off on a whole huge bundle of comics. The titles that we're talking about today can also be found at Discount Comic Book Service. Von Spatz is relisted, and you can get that for 30% off. Resident Alien, Alien in New York, #3 of 4, and we're going to be talking about #1 today, is also there at DCBS for 40% off, and you can find Skyward from Image Comics, issue #3 this month for 40% off. So, you know, all the great comic stuff that we're talking about here, you can find at Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. You know, you may think you can beat the prices of Discount Comic Book Service, but you really can't.
It's going to be hard to do.
You just can't. That's right. Check out their website, dcbservice.com, because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, please let them know for us.
How are things going with you, Paul?
I'm well. Just wrapping up, getting toward the end of the school year. So, on that last lap of my dissertation writing. And you, Derek, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Just kind of busy with things, especially the podcast. In fact, listeners of the Comics Alternative will note that lately we've been doing a lot of interviews.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason for that, I mean, I didn't necessarily plan all of them at about the same time. It's just given the schedule of the creators and also the various titles releases, it's just the way things have turned out. And also we're dealing with quite a number of spring releases that are coming up, some that are already out, some that are about to. So a lot of interviews on the Comics Alternative.
Yeah. I hope folks are checking in with as many of them as they might be able to keep up with. At this point, Derek, you're becoming a daily commute. You're like morning talk radio now, constantly in our ears. But I think with probably how busy it must be for you to do all those interviews, it's maybe lost on you a little bit how much it means to us who listen that you are talking to creators of such variety and and diversity, and also that we know it's a ton of work. And I don't know, I as a listener am thoroughly enjoying it, so appreciate it. It's been fun.
I enjoy it, so I'm glad that you're getting something out of those interviews, and I hope our other listeners are as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But on today's show, no interviews, but we will instead talk about 3 recent titles. And we're going to begin with, I guess, a different kind of comic. This is von Spatz, written and illustrated by Anna Haifisch. This came out from Drawn Quarterly last month, around the middle of March. And Paul, were you familiar with Anna Haifisch's previous work? I know she had another Drawn Quarterly book, The Artist, that came out about a little over a year ago.
Yeah, apart from knowing that book had come out, no, I wasn't familiar with her work. So I went into this pretty blind to the style, Haifisch's style. So I'm curious what you thought about it, but I hadn't had previous exposure to Haifisch.
You know, my introduction to Haifisch is basically the same as yours. It's this book. I knew about The Artist, and I had wanted to check it out when it was first released back in November of 2016, but I never got around to it. This book just coming out, or at least in English. Now, Haifisch is German, so this was originally published in Germany, but now we have an English translation.
Right.
So this was my initial exposure to Haifisch's work. And maybe one place to begin in terms of describing what people can expect with von Spatz is to look at Haifisch's style. This is a text that's in color, but she uses kind of basic colors, although in a more pastel manner. So they're not bright, they're not disruptive or abrupt colors. In her art style, I want to use the word cartoony, but not in any kind of pejorative sense. Yeah. They look like something out of animation. At times. And some of her characters have kind of an animal or bird-like appearance to them. And in fact, the main character in this book, Walt Disney, the actual Walt Disney, well, kind of, looks like some kind of bird-type character. But then we have a couple of other artists, Tommy Ungerer, and then Saul Steinberg. And one looks more like a mouse, another one like a cat. And then there are other characters in the book that seem to look like one form of animal or another. And in fact, there's one that I can't remember his name, but he strikes me as someone who was drawn to look like Louis Trondheim.
Or Louis Trondheim's self-representation.
Oh, yes,
exactly.
And that had to be intentional.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, there is some, there's a scene where the characters are cartooning one another, very early in the book. So it's a clear indication that, I think that it's appropriate to start with, the cartooning, because I think this is very much a book about cartooning among the arts. And so, those comparisons, I think, are apropos. In fact, the comparison to animation you mentioned, because we're talking here about Walt Disney. But what links the well-known artists, and to me, Disney, of course, is someone we all know. Steinberg is someone I was loosely familiar with because of his work in The New Yorker. Ungerer wasn't an artist that I was familiar with, but a quick Wikipedia, sort of solved that right away. And I looked at some of his other art, and it struck me that all 3 of those artists, more sort of mid-20th century artists, were very much crossover people, people who spanned, I guess, what you could call cartooning, or magazine illustration and other arts, ranging from sculpture to, of course, film. So they have a likeness there. But, actually saying that all this maybe, neglects the tone of the book. Basically what happens, in a very comedic kind of way, Disney is doing his Walt Disney thing, sort of, lashing the whip to make his animators draw, and going a little crazy. And so he needs to take a spell at the von Spatz Rehab Center, a clinic for his mental health. He's his anxieties have withered him away to, he says, I weighed about as much as a house cat when he arrives at the von Spatz. And so there, through a combination of, I don't know, what looks like art therapy and group therapy and taking care of some penguins at a penguin pool, which I can imagine being quite therapeutic. And
don't forget the hot dog booth.
That's right. There's a hot dog booth, and that is that's important for healing. These artists and the other residents, along with I think her name is Margaret von Spatz, which I guess is the sort of the head therapist, make their way through their issues, and I think that's what roughly what the book is about.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the clinic manager, Marguerite von Spatz. Mm-hmm. Now, it has nothing to do with the story, if we can call it that, proper. Mm-hmm. But if you open up the French flaps of this book, now you're looking at a PDF.
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So you may not be able to do this, I guess. I'm looking at a physical copy I actually had pre-ordered from Discount Comic Book Service.
Awesome.
And if you open up its French flaps, then you see two bits, one in the front, inside front cover, one in the back inside front or back cover, that gives you, I guess you could say, additional information of some sort. And in the inside front cover, there seems to be something like a quick visual rundown of the history of the von Spatz family. I mean, it doesn't tell you much, but you do see an image of Marguerite von Spatz. You see the von Spatz family when they lived in Vienna around the time of 1938.
Right.
And along with that, there's an image of Hitler. There is a picture of Marguerite in 1965 where she looks kind of like a hippie character. There is an image of another von Spatz member, Ingrid, and her death in 1992 when the patriarch of the family, Alois von Spatz, was visiting, I guess, California in the 1940s. So little things like that.
Okay.
And then in the inside back cover, if you open up the French flaps, there's what's called here the von Spatz Hall of Fame. And in the Hall of Fame are characters like Wile E. Coyote, who apparently was in the Hall of Fame from 1992 to 2000, Woodstock from Peanuts from 75 to 79, and then creators like Charles Schultz, Asuma Tezuka, Tove Jansson, people like that. So it's strange. And also there's Anna Haifisch, 2023 to question mark. It's a little strange, but goes hand in hand with the story proper in von Spatz, which is a little strange.
Right. And just to clarify, von Spatz, not a historical figure, right? This is all part of the narrative fiction. Am I right about that?
Yeah, it's as far as I know.
Okay.
And in fact, the main characters that we have in the book that are based, whose names at least are anchored to actual historical characters,
That's right. Yeah.
Walt Disney, Tommy Ungerer, and Saul Steinberg,
Right.
do not look anything like Walt, Tommy, or Saul.
Right.
Because with Walt Disney, this is, as I mentioned previously, he looks like a bird-type character who wears this really large hat and has suspenders.
Although I thought that was a characteristic outfit of the actual Walt Disney. Is that, am I wrong
wearing
about
suspenders and a big hat?
I thought so. I think that I've seen a picture before. I could be wrong about that, but I know it looks silly, but I feel like that is maybe a Walt Disney trademark, maybe.
I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
see, because when I see this figure, I think of a farmer or a hillbilly, something like that.
Sure.
Because that's what the character seems to look like. But maybe Haifisch is basing this on more historical reality than I'm aware of. And of course, I don't know what defined Ungerer or Steinberg in terms of their appearance. But
Right. But you're right. We should make clear as we're talking about these, it's very abstract and very cartooned. Not a historical rendition of these characters, but maybe of their essences, and maybe that's
could be.
Maybe that's the point, right? Yeah.
And earlier I mentioned that when I called von Spatz, the story, I said if we want to call it a story,
right.
It's not necessarily a linear narrative.
Yeah.
I guess there is a beginning, middle, and end that revolves around Walt Disney. As you pointed out, he has a breakdown. He goes into the von Spatz Institute for rehabilitation, goes through a particular routine therapy, meets other artists, and then at the end, he feels that he's okay and he leaves. And so, and then what he comes back to in terms of the Walt Disney Studios is really wild. I don't want to give anything away, but it really made the end of the book for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there is a rough story that I guess you could argue is linear in nature, but the majority of von Spatz is just a series of anecdotes.
Yeah,
right?
It's told through vignettes. Yeah.
Vignettes, a better way of putting that. So you will see some of these are relatively short, maybe just 1 page long. Like I'm looking at one here, a 1-page vignette called The Advice. And on this one, I think it's Saul Steinberg comes up to Walt Disney, who's sitting by the pool lounging, and Saul says, "Walt, will you have a look at my drawing?" And of course, Walt looks at it, and then he responds, "The animal in the middle is nice. You've disregarded the background." And then in the last panel, Steinberg is looking at his image, which is like just a bird against a white background.
Right.
And that's it.
Right.
And it may sound strange and rather absurd, but that's what these vignettes are for the most part. I mean, there's some that probably have more narrative elements than others.
Right.
But you do have this series of vignettes that maybe tell us more about the characters' personalities and the way that they interact, more than an emphasis being placed on action and event. In other words, plot.
Yeah. And I think that part of that, let's see, I guess if somebody wanted to understand what this book is doing, I would say one part New Yorker cartoon, right? One part Trondheim, that's definitely, I think the illusion there is intentional, in terms of the artist's self-representation as cartoon. And then I'm thinking about that What About Bob moving, which I don't know how that movie holds up these days, but just sort of the humorous take on the need for the sort of mental rehab, and I think with all that we've said about it, there's a lightness to this book that is part of its profundity and also makes it huge fun. That page that you just talked about, I had several, I have to admit, being totally charmed by this book. Sort of surprised to be as charmed as I was by this book. But some of these vignettes are just made me laugh out loud. There's one that is just a 1-page single panel, and it's entitled Tomy, as in Tom Younger, and he's standing before a large, beautiful landscape painting, and in that scenario you'd expect him to be painting the landscape. Instead, he's painting a picture of his own face, sort of angry self-portrait, which is, hilarious and ridiculous given that he's standing in front of this beautiful horizon. And I think that's part of the joke, and also part of the idea, the contemplation of what some of these arts are. We're standing before a vast landscape of beautiful stuff to render, but we're all sort of navel gazing in our art. And
well, actually, okay, I looked at that page that you are describing now, and it's not himself, because
you're right.
Ungerer is shown as a mouse, but what he's painting is a cat's face.
Oh yeah, and is that one of our cats? No, I guess not.
No, but but
you're right.
Yeah. Now, the Saul Steinberg character is someone who seems to be associated with cats every now and again. You'll see him rubbing a cat. But I mean, but the joke is still there, even though it may not be on the level of navel gazing.
Yeah,
he has a landscape. but he's painting something completely different.
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
Maybe whoever is in his deep in his consciousness, right?
Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite vignettes is, I guess, a little past halfway through. This one is titled The Exhibition, and this is one of the longer vignettes in the book. And it begins with Walt Disney. He's inside of his room, and it's a mess. There's art stuff, paper, paints, all over the place.
Right.
Furniture is turned upside down, it looks like. And Disney is laying face down on the floor in the middle of a train track. Right. And apparently the train is moving around the track.
A toy train. Yeah, a toy train.
Yes.
Right.
And so, be clear there. So as he's laying there, he hears a knock on the door, and I guess it's outside is Tommy and Saul, and Tommy says, "Open the damn door, Walt." And then Walt gets up, answers the door, and they say, "Here, we brought you an outfit for the show." So they're going to an art exhibition. And when they get there, everyone is looking nice in what appears to be more formal attire, except for the three of them.
Right.
So I guess Tommy is wearing what looks like pajamas with pineapples on it.
Purple pajamas with
exactly.
pineapples on it.
And then Saul is wearing, looks like a psychedelic color onesie of some sort.
With animal ears of some kind.
Yes, with animal ears. And then the shirt that they gave Walt to wear is just a white T-shirt that says, "I'm with stupid," and an arrow pointing to the side. And so when they get there, Marguerite, the manager of the facility, is really pissed off that they didn't take it seriously. And so they start screwing things up.
She says, "What kind of idiot's parade is this?" That panel made me laugh out loud. I had to show my wife. Yeah. That's a good one. It's a great picture of the sense of humor that's in this book. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's what most of these vignettes are like.
Right.
Almost all of them have some kind of humor embedded in it in one form or another. I don't remember any that take a more serious or even darker turn, unless I'm forgetting something.
My feeling about this, and not my place to quibble with another critic, but I read a review of this that complained a bit that it was fun and interesting premise, but insubstantial and maybe wasn't saying anything. And I thought that was totally off mark as a criticism, because and not to say that I don't think it's meant to be. I think the review said that it lacked gravitas. Not to single out somebody, I don't know, but I disagree with that profoundly, because I think that there is, the context of them being in a place of healing from anxiety, where there's some reflection here, I think, about recovery, and the role of humor and art and imagination and fun. And really, actually, most importantly, I think the social, aspects of recovery, of these sort of artists poking fun at each other and playing tricks on each other and things like that. That sense of community. And again, not to overthink it. I'm definitely sounding like I'm overthinking it. I guess I'm just saying that if you can't appreciate sort of the reflections on art, on, culture, and on its role in our, sort of our mental states, whatever, then I feel like, you don't get cartooning, you don't get Harriman, you don't get that, there is a profundity in all this stuff. It's just not it's like this, that's like asking of a sculpture, why I don't like the narrative that this sculpture lacks, like this is cartooning doing what cartooning does brilliantly, which is just, that's my feeling about this book. So yeah, you're right. None of these vignettes are heavy. But I think they are, I keep using this word, profound in their way.
I agree. And I don't know what review you're referring to, but when you were describing that reviewer's reaction, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe they were taking too much of a cue from the publicity material, I'm assuming publicity, that's embedded in the text. In let's say the paratextual material. So for instance, on the inside of the front cover, there is, as you will find with almost every book, something that, it could be an something written in editorial or marketing, but something that kind of sells the book, right? Mm-hmm. And at one point, they're describing von Spatz this way: part study of isolation, part tale of begrudging camaraderie. Daily life at the center mixes with reminiscences from the world outside. And when I read that, I thought, okay. Then I read the book, and then I went back to read that blurb, and I thought maybe the person who wrote this blurb was intentionally inflating this to be a little more serious and heavy than the book actually is, or as many times is the case, and I know because I've worked in publishing,
sure.
Someone either didn't completely read the text or didn't get where the author was, at least what I think, where it's intending to go. And so they wrote something that sounded profound, more profound than the text actually is. And I do think that there are some serious things that Haifisch is doing in this text. But you're right, it is not a deeply philosophical work. But I don't think it ever intends to be. There are serious things that Haifisch is saying about the art of creation, what it can do to an individual, and how, I guess, a more social connection could be what is needed, because the creation of art, whether it be visual or otherwise, is in many ways a solitary occupation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And even in Disney's case, as he's, pushing his animators, as he says, admits in the beginning. It is solitary because he put himself in the position of a creator, driving others as if they were, they were his art slaves, And so it's isolating in that sense. And so what's funny is the first thing that, he does that, von Spatz has them do is to draw, and they wind up drawing renditions of each other, and the reactions to those renditions of each other are hilarious. But it's also interesting just to think about how that's like a first step away from that isolation, of sort of obsessive work, to actually just sit and draw each other, look at each other, and that is an interesting contrast.
Yeah, and you pointed out what Walt Disney's approach to the studio had done to him. We also see at the very end, and again, I don't want to give anything away, what that approach of Disney's did to the studio. Because when he comes back from the von Spatz Rehabilitation Center and sees what's happened to his studio, I mean, it's kind of dark in a strangely funny way.
Just dark humor kind of way. Yeah. Yeah. So, there is something with gravity, I guess, going on in von Spatz, that maybe the reviewer just couldn't get past his or her laughs as the individual was reading through the book. Yeah. And I want to be clear. There's nothing didactic about this book at all. There's a lot of like, oh, I'm tired of this, I'm laying in bed, and even a scene, there's a one pager called Main Street USA, where, these sort of classic looking Disney characters are marching in a parade through, I guess, what is a Main Street USA that, could be taken, you can read into that or read out of that, a lot of statement about, these commercial,
and Disney's looking through the window at the parade.
That's right. Very right. Sorry, I missed that key point. But, there's a lot that can be said about this book. So I definitely, would defy that characterization that it lacks, importance. But I think it does it through the gifts of cartooning. Yeah. So. Yeah, I think it's cool too to think about this book as an example of cartooning among the arts. And I do think that for instance, the characters selected here and their place in broader popular culture and high lowbrow acceptance and so forth becomes a kind of statement about the status of cartoons among the various arts. So I like that about it as well.
Yeah. Now, one of the other vignettes, this is one toward the end. I want to get your take on this. This is a 2-pager, and we don't have page numbers, but it's one where actually it's titled, I think, 12-5.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's a date.
Yeah.
But, Walt, Saul, and Tommy are laying out in Barker lounges, it looks like, collapsible ones, just enjoying the sun or whatever they're about to experience. Then they put on shades. And then on the next page, we see what they're putting shades on for, because there's some kind of eclipse going on.
Looks like a lunar eclipse, maybe. Yeah.
Now, look at that page. Yeah, look at that page with the eclipse.
Yeah.
What does it remind you of?
Not seeing
the
it.
layout of the panels. Well, it looks like some kind of face. Because okay, I'll try to describe for our listeners, because this is not a visual podcast.
Yeah.
Basically, this page with the eclipse.
Yeah.
You have two strips, and the bottom strip is the wider one, and it's just one panel, and that's where you actually do see this eclipse.
Right.
And then the strip above, you have two smaller panels of about the same size, where you see the eclipse beginning and then progressing, and then in that one panel underneath the larger one, you get the full eclipse. So it looks like a face with that lower one has a nose, and then the top two look like something like eyes.
Yep.
So it's a face of some sort. Another thing I was wondering is this some kind of visual tip of the pen to Mickey Mouse? Because those eyes, so to speak, in the top two panels could be ears in a way.
Oh,
And since Walt Disney's looking at it, I don't know.
Sure.
Maybe I'm making too much out of that.
No, I don't think you are at all, because whether it's a Mickey Mouse or whether it's cartoon eyes, the sort of sliver eyes, because this is the sun sort of waning as the eclipse overtakes it. No, it could absolutely be those things. No, you're right. I mean, that composition, how could I not see that face? What I wondered if you were saying is if actually, and I mentioned him earlier, but if it's an allusion to Harriman, Crazy Cat would often, I remember actually just a whole sequence of panels that was essentially the waxing and waning of the moon, perhaps, something like that. But, the landscapes too give me this sense, we're out in this sort of remote desert-ish, which is, not quite the Crazy Cat. What is it? Coconino? I forget the location of Crazy Cat, but it's a little bit of that sense too. Yeah. No, that's an interesting video. I wonder if 12/5 is a date, if that's, when there was an eclipse.
That's what it
or something
seems like
that. Yeah. But, I do think that is yeah, you're right. I think that second page is a face. If it is a cartoon face, it's a contented one. And as you said, this is later in the book. So this short vignette, if you do think that there is some kind of bigger narrative trajectory, there's a kind of peace. Right. The three are sort of happily cohabitating and, lounging. And by this point, we've gone through some things. This is right after the, no, is it? No. I was going to say this is right after the exhibition vignette, but it kind of, we're getting close. Actually, no, it precedes when
it comes right before the one called So Long, Walt, where he leaves von Spatz.
That's
to
right.
Go back
That's
home.
right. That's right. Right. Sorry.
So what you're reading about this being not only a more peaceful, calming image, but one that suggests some form of healing.
That's right. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, there's a vignette that happens a little before that. This one's called Saul's Cat, and Saul has a cat. There's something wrong with the cat. It does look a little on the freaky side. They take him to some kind of animal clinic. And while they're at the animal clinic, Saul goes into the bathroom to wash his hands, I guess, or to use the bathroom. And at the sink, he looks over and he sees this figure, looks like a wolf. And the wolf has a tie and a jacket on. And on the jacket is a kind of a badge stitched on the lapel that looks like the WB figure, Warner Brothers, right? But we don't know if that's the case or not. Right. And the wolf looks at him, and then as the wolf is leaving the bathroom, he gets a phone call. He answers the phone. He says, "Yeah, this is Wolf. Got it." And then he peeks his head, the wolf does, into another room and says, "Bad news, fellas. Our star act didn't survive." and then several wolves that look just like the other wolf come out of the room. And then Saul is watching this, and he has a look on his face. We have no frigging clue what's going on or what Saul is interpreting. And maybe that look on his face is not one of interpretation, but of perplexedness.
Yeah.
And that way he's a stand-in to the reader.
Yeah. Or even horror. There's a little bit of like, oh my gosh. Yeah, what am I looking at? I mean, that's how I see it. The eyes
especially
look
with
like
the mouth, because his face momentarily looks like a skeleton head.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and if WB Wolf comes to represent the kind of maybe base commercial art and their reaction, they're pretty nonplussed that their star act didn't survive. They're just sort of smoking and walking.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe this is what happens to these characters when they're mass produced in celluloid. I don't know.
Yeah. And, the WB, Warner Brothers, within the context of Disney, all makes sense.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I actually, the more we talk about this book and as I flip through it, the more I like it. I think it's just packed quite a lot, very economically, into its pages. I love the way it opens. It starts with a series of quotes, and I just read George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, so I'm kind of primed for this idea that a series of quotes and their attributions can begin to introduce characters to us, or actually can be how the characters relate themselves. So the very first page, I forget, what do you call that? Where you have the, somebody says such and such at the beginning of the page, the little, epigraph.
Yeah. It could be an epigram or dedication page.
Exactly. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah. What it is, it's a series of statements of, von Spatz herself and then, some others, including Steinberg and Disney. And that was a great way in because, they're commenting on, apparently the clinic, but it seems like a series of random statements, but they're all elements that wind up showing up in the clinic itself. And then you get into the first actual, drawn page, which is Walt in a circle, in what I guess is group therapy. And all the characters are looking a little bit, I don't know, distracted or
jaded.
Whatever. Jaded, right. But I think it is a great picture of the overall, situation of recovery and healing that is going on in this story. And also the kind of playful jab at that too. So, yeah.
And you mentioned the word playful. I can't help but think of the haikus, quote unquote haikus, that we get in this book. There are 3 vignettes that are titled Haiku 1, Haiku 2, Haiku 3, and none of them are either traditional haikus or even more contemporary takes on the haiku.
Right.
At least as it's normally practiced. And an example of this is the very last vignette of the book. And so this one is Haiku 3. And here you see Walt, back home after having gone to von Spatz. And the haiku supposedly is, pass this on. He loved mice and happily ate hot dogs. Now, it has a haiku feel to it, just as the other 2 vignettes titled Haiku 1 and 2 has somewhat of a haiku feel, but these aren't haikus.
Yeah. Maybe they're just spiritual haiku.
Yes.
Haikus, right.
Haikuish in spirit.
That's right. Yeah, but they're definitely simple. In fact, he's pruning in that last one. I don't think this gives anything away. He's pruning a pine tree. What am I saying? A palm tree, which is a very sort of Hollywood version of, sort of meditative Zen, practice here. So it is a funny way of rendering his coming to terms with things. Happily ate hot dogs.
Paul, Paul, you want to move on to the second title we're going to discuss this week?
Sure, let's do it.
This is Skyward #1, written by Joe Henderson and with art by Lee Garbett. This is coming out, actually, as this episode is going up, so on April 18th.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, I know that Lee Garbett has done work for the Big Two, among other publishers, but I'm not familiar with the work of Joe Henderson. Does he ring a bell with you?
No, neither do I, and I should have done a little bit more research. But you're right, Garbett's work on there was a series Marvel recently did centered on Loki, the character Loki, that I really enjoyed and noticed his art, and actually then went back and realized, oh, I know this artist because I'm familiar with the work that he did on Batgirl for a time with Brian Q. Miller. So that's known. But the only bells Joe Henderson rings is as a jazz musician. I don't think that's the same Joe Henderson. So.
No.
Yeah.
But yeah, Garbett's work is really good. In fact, I think it's one of the things that marks this series, at least initially. But I say that not wanting to take anything away from Henderson's writing, because I think as a first issue, this does a pretty good job of setting up the series.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hate to just judge Image series against Image series, but I'm going to.
No, go ahead. In fact, I anticipated you doing that because I've heard on the comic syllabus one or two times you've made comments, and I agree with you about the kind of sameness about a lot of Image series.
Yeah, and one reason I think that happens, and maybe why it's unfair to criticize them that way, I mean, there's sameness in every genre, right? Is that every one of them has to establish its own world, because the creator is, in almost every case, establishing a world within this story, right? They're not crossover universes usually. So there's a lot of sort of world establishing that needs to be done in an opening issue or even opening arc. And I think some creators take the chance to be real mysterious. I'm thinking of your Hickmans and Remenders who tend to cloak a lot of things in a ton of maybe mystery isn't even the right word, but it can be kind of opaque. You just sort of have to trust that you're going to figure things out as it goes along. And I think that's one tack to take. This one takes the other one, which is, I think, to set up a very promising and interesting premise right from the get-go. Why it's happening is not clear, but that it's happening is clear. And what is happening essentially is we meet a family, roughly in our time, maybe. But soon what happens is that gravity stops functioning. And so then we're, midway through this issue, transported to the not too distant future, 20 years from now, where, apparently gravity has stopped functioning in the way that it normally does. And so everything and everyone is sort of floating in midair, if they're not anchored to something. So that's, kind of the setup. But I think that setup in that world, all laid out pretty clearly. And I'm finding that the Image series that do that, are making a certain kind of choice, are taking a certain kind of risk. And in this case, I do think it works. I agree with what I think I hear you saying. That I liked the setup, the premise that this first issue does. Yeah. Am I right about that? Did you like
I did.
Where this is going? Okay.
I did. And we should, I guess, note that there is some gravity in this world. It's not our world without gravity. I mean, that would be completely disastrous. You wouldn't have a series going beyond, let's say, the first few pages.
That's right.
But it's low gravity. And in fact, the title of this first narrative arc is My Low G Life.
That's right.
And in essence, with this first issue, and you did a good job of setting everything up, what goes on in this first issue, but the issue is basically divided almost evenly in two halves. And so the first half takes place in what, as you mentioned, looks like the same kind of world that we inhabit right now. And then the second half is 20 years after that event, whatever caused this low gravity on Earth. And so in that first half, we're introduced to our protagonist whose name is Willa. Although when we see her, she is a baby and her father's putting her to sleep. Then he comes in and he starts talking with his wife, Lily. And that's when the low gravity hits because he realizes this. He, I think, spills his coffee, but he notices that the coffee doesn't spill. It kind of floats up or hovers in air. And he makes a comment that the first time I read this issue, I didn't pay attention to it, but going back and rereading it, I thought had more import because he makes a comment. He says, when his coffee falls off, he says, "It's happening.
Right.
No one believed me, but I was right." And then as he's saying that, he realizes that not only is his coffee suspended in air and floating up slowly, but his wife is as well.
She's out jogging.
Exactly. And so it's not a spoiler, but Nate, the father, loses his wife, Lily. Basically, she just floats out.
That's
up into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And so he runs back in. When he can't save his wife, he runs back into the bedroom and makes sure that Willa's safe. Then we fast forward 20 years. And so the second half of this first issue is, I guess, a more formal introduction to the main character, Willa, and what she and others have made of life on Earth in low G, an atmosphere, a low G atmosphere. And so what she does is she works at a company called Rocket Messengers, and she and others who are part of this company are tasked with delivering things, packages, what have you, from one place to another, because movement on Earth now with low gravity is not what it used to be. And so she has some interesting ways of propelling herself from one location to another, some of which aren't necessarily orthodox. But we get the sense in the second half of this first issue that she is adept at what she does. And if her father, because we do come back to the father at the end of this first episode, if the father seems a little uncertain or even suspicious of low gravity, Willa, his daughter, on the other hand, is someone, because she's grown up in this atmosphere, is much more at home in it and uses it to her advantage.
Yes, yeah. And that's the difference between, say, if you grew up in an internet-connected home and not, and how comfortable you are. So this is her native world. In fact, she has a little chat with a friend who she admits she's flirting with.
Edison?
Yeah, that's right. He's slightly older, and so she has a little chat with him. Do you remember what it's like when gravity was the old way? And so this has been her, basically her almost entire experience. Yeah. No, I feel the urgency to come back to what you started with, which is the art, because I think Lee Garbett does it's a phenomenally drawn book. I loved the art. And I don't mean to damn with faint praise. This might sound backhanded, but I think the best thing that Joe Henderson does as a writer is not to overwrite the story, but you can see where it's, pretty carefully crafted to do what it needs to do, but also in some ways to let the art do its work, because the premise itself sets up, kind of visual possibilities, right? Of, like you said, the coffee floating in the air. He runs out to the neighborhood, and then really the whole neighborhood, including tanker trucks and people in business suits, are flying in the air. And then later in the second half, as you pointed out, there is the way that she shows that she's native to this world. Willa shows that she has grown up among this. So there's an exuberance as she's sort of flying through the air. That's like the stuff of our dreams, captured with such visual effervescence by Garbett. It's just, it's fun. The places that you're meant to feel a little bit claustrophobic and a sense of tension with her latter day father, for instance, are just drawn with, again, audio podcast, visual medium, but drawn in all these ways with these angles and corners that make you feel that claustrophobia. So just artistically, and not to mention just the style is just like a style I really like. It just looks cool, looks fun. Reminds me a little bit of Amy Reeder's art in Rocket Girl, which is, I think, another very beautiful series. So yeah, I think it's taken the best advantage of this premise artistically. And, that's, weighs heavily for me on giving the thumbs up for this.
I want to come back to something that you said just a moment ago, and that was the exuberance. I think that's the word that you used in the way that our protagonist Willa engages with her low gravity world.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Look at the cover. because the cover was, I guess for obvious reasons, the very first thing I remember seeing about this title. And in fact, I remember when it was first solicited about 2 or 3 months ago, I was on the preview show with Gwen, and we both commented on this, and I was thinking this, maybe I even said it.
I think you did.
On air at the time, that there's something about this cover that just struck me that I thought that this may be a title for younger readers.
Yeah.
Something like you might find at Boom Studios, not so much at Image. And if you look at that cover, what Garbett does with this image, and basically if our listeners haven't seen the cover yet, it is an image of Willa upside down. It looks like she's hovering over the city because the silhouette of the landscape is down below, and she has her eyes closed, but she has a look on her face of satisfaction, almost as if she's luxuriating in her floatingness.
Yes.
That's going on. And there's something, when I looked at that cover, it just struck me as, oh, this is going to be for younger readers. But then I read this first issue, and I don't get that sense. Now, I do think, from what I've seen, at least in terms of the first issue, I mean, this is something that I would describe could be for all ages, right? So I think a younger reader could get something out of this as well. But it doesn't strike me as what I assumed it was at first, which is something that you would be maybe more apt to find at Boom Studios.
Yeah. I think you make a good point there. There's I think to me, the cover it's a combination of the expression on her face, the color palette with these purple, blues, and greens that signal like a Boom-like style, I think that's that's an apt comparison. And then just something in the rendering, and this is true in the inside too, and the style of faces, for instance, that is, I think, a very contemporary merger of a lot of, animation and things, and it just kind of things out in the ether, in the artistic ether, that do kind of send the signals of a young enthusiasm in the book. And so I wondered the same. I'm always on the always on the lookout, as you know, for things that I might be able to read with my kid. Things that might be all ages. And so I don't know if they intend to take this to much darker themes. There's the presence of a B word in here, which is always kind of it's a dumb signal, but it's a signal to me, that, of intended audience. And I was a little disappointed in that, because I think that the visual appeal and the sort of, prospects of the story would be really fun to read with a younger reader, but I don't know that it's being set up that way. Instead, I think when I say younger, maybe it's fair to say it's being set up for a young adult audience, young adult and above kind of audience.
When you talk about the language, are you referring to at one point when she's making a delivery?
Yes. Okay. She is making a delivery.
And she's held up. That's
right. She's held up, and the criminal throws that out there. I sound really prudish to say like a B word, but you know what I mean. So it just those things as an indicator of what they're thinking about in terms of audience.
Well, what does it say about me? That word didn't stand out for me when I was reading that section. So I had to go back and look as you were describing. It's like, hey, where was this? I don't remember that.
Yeah, I guess if I was an editor, I just would send back a note of, one, I don't think it added too much to the story. I'm not trying to sit here and quibble with a swear. You know what I mean? Like, that's not a big deal. But I just mean, like, why erase the chance for this to be something that might be a good, younger reader book as well? But maybe the story is going to go, I could see with the story going places where you're not necessarily targeting that age. So I get it. It was just a little bit disappointing to me, because I always hold out hope that this might be something that, you can read with your kid. Yeah.
It could be. And I think I'm with you in that Skyward, at least from this first issue, seems to some degree to have the potential of being the kind of comic you could read with someone who's younger, like one of your children. Except for the use of, as you put it, the B word. But also there's something that happens at the end, or close to the end, and this is not a spoiler in any way, but when Willa goes back home, she sees her father, and her father is working out. Now, the way that you need to exercise your muscles in a low-gravity atmosphere is very different than the way that we exercise normally now.
Sure.
And so the father's doing that in his apartment, And when Willa goes over to see him, she has kind of a disgusted look on her face, and she says, "Ugh, I think I breathed in some of your sweat."
Right, because
you promised you'd clean. Yeah, it's floating. You promised you'd clean up after yourself. Now, that kind of grossness. Okay, you can have grossness for texts that are intended for a younger audience, especially if it has something to do with butts or farting or things of that sort, right? Or underpants. But I don't know.
You can make a captain out of underpants.
Exactly, in an entire series that sells very, very well.
Sure, very well, right?
On the other hand, there's a kind of grossness that is a little on the darker side that, I don't know if this makes sense, but a grossness that's more adult. And this is a grossness that strikes me as a little more adult and less butt-oriented, breathing in someone else's sweat. I love that realistic touch that Henderson and then through the yard Garbett have given this.
Right.
Because I think some people who were creating a world like this may not even think of something as almost pedestrian as your sweat floating up and then being subject to being inhaled by others.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, but that strikes me as, again, if this makes sense, a more sophisticated kind of grossness than you would find in a text for younger readers.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think that scene is a great example of this book being smart but not overwritten, because it's fairly simple, but it's actually thinking through the situation. One, if we have less gravity, you have to do more exercise because this whole thing about space travel and our bones deteriorating and stuff like that. So it strikes me that maybe he's doing exercise not only to be the buffed, handsome older gentleman that he is, but also because he needs to in a lower gravity situation. But that he's doing that. I mean, that's what an earthbound person, a 9.8 Gs or whatever, person would do. It's kind of like an old person's way of coping with the way this world has changed. Whereas she, as a young person, doesn't need to sit at home and strap herself to an exercise machine because she's out there embracing the world and finding out ways to be physical like Spider-Man among the buildings, right? And so, but there is a kind of grossness definitely to that sweat, but there's also a somberness, I guess, to his, aspect. At this moment. And I assume that part of it is, as you said, the hint that's given early that he knows about all this. And also the fact that he's lost his wife, and so you can tell there's a definite, maybe a rift that needs to be reconciled that's set up here between, their as a family sense of having lost, there's a really poignant moment actually in the midst of all the excitement of the beginning where he has to make a choice in essence to go after and try and save his wife who's floating off into space, or to go back and take care of baby Willa. So, I think that all kind of weighs in that moment, where we see an older, Nate is his name, his dad.
Yeah. You use the word somber to describe that final scene where Willa comes to the apartment and talks with her father. There's something about the visuals that underscores that somberness. And this is the one part of this first issue where the colors are muted and noticeably darker, primarily in grays and browns.
Yep. Because
even at the very beginning, when this gravitational crisis, if we want to call it that, takes place, we still have brighter colors. And as Willa, in the middle of this first issue, is basically, or at least in the last half, I guess, is hopping around with her delivery work, we get the blue skies, we get the brighter colors of the children that she delivers to.
That's right.
The sun. Now, granted, this final scene takes place inside Nate's apartment. And so it is going to be darker, less vibrant in terms of sunlight and whatnot. But at the same time, the darker, more muted colors underscores the more serious aspect, and I think underlying this narrative world. And again, without giving anything away, we find out on the very last page that Nate, the father, thinks that he may understand why things are the way that they are, which takes us back to what happens at the very beginning when he says something to the effect of, I was right. Now, there's a big mystery. What is he right about and what's going on? Those are big questions that drive this narrative world, at least for me. And so
Yep.
I'm unsure how long this series will last for. Who knows?
Right.
But I would hope that within the next 2 or 3 issues, definitely within this first narrative arc, that some of those questions will be answered, at least enough to be satisfying.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would judge this as extremely promising, image number 1, you know, I like it a lot. And we should mention Antonio Fabella as the colorist. And you're right, does a beautiful job of having really, I think, a sunlit, which is so important with this premise, right? It's about, you know, lower gravity and being able to fly in the air. So the ability to capture clouds and sunlight, and even the warmth of the sun in that opening scene, that domestic scene, the warmth of the sun coming in through the windows is a huge part of the coloring and the lighting that gives the sense of warmth in the family, you know. But clearly, I think at the end, Nate is living in a much more holed up situation in his apartment, and probably because of a certain fear of the outside that he has, you know, which is very containing to the spirits of Willa. You can kind of see that. So all that is conveyed, as you were saying, beautifully by the color. I'm excited. I'm gonna be following this series for sure.
I will as well. Well, Paul, we were just talking about a series based on low gravity. Actually, I didn't think about this until just now. There is some kind of thematic link between Skyward #1 and the next issue that we're going to look at, Resident Alien, an Alien in New York, issue #1, because we're dealing with someone who is from outer space, a place of low or zero gravity. Maybe that's too forced of a connection.
No, Derek, that wins the Segway Award. You did it.
I was trying.
That's pretty good.
I can't connect it to Von Spatz, though.
That's harder. That's a little hard. That's a little more distant.
Well, some people think artists are a little spacey. How about that?
There is a little bit of art involved in this issue, so it's art that reveals oneself. There we go.
So for those who may not be familiar, Resident Alien, this is a series from Dark Horse Comics, and this first issue was actually released last week on April 11th. And Resident Alien is a series, a periodic series that began in 2012. The initial series was later collected as, I guess, a first narrative arc in a trade, Welcome to Earth. And then in 2003, there was another mini-series of Resident Alien called Suicide Blonde. And then 2 years after that, 2015, the third volume, The Sam Hain Mystery. And then a couple of years ago, not quite 2 years ago, we got the fourth narrative arc, The Man with No Name. And so now we're at the beginning of what will be the fifth volume, An Alien in New York. Paul, were you familiar with the Resident Alien series before this first issue of An Alien in New York?
I'm glad you asked, and this will be, I think, maybe an interesting position for our conversation. I was familiar with it via the Comics Alternative podcast, because you would often make mention of it every time on previews or whatever that they were coming up. I was kind of surprised to hear you just say that Man with No Name was 2 years ago. It seems like Resident Alien is always kind of hanging around doing something, but maybe it's just the various forms of the collection that you've mentioned. So no, I haven't read them. I've been curious about them because you've talked about them. But I'm excited here to, I'll be the novice diving in at the fifth arc, and we'll see how confused and lost I am as I read.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that you're not familiar with the previous Resident Alien comics, because your perspective, just coming on board with this latest issue, is going to be quite different from my perspective. And so you could tell me if something like this is understandable, right? Coming in the middle of something. Yeah. Now, one of those episodes that you may be referring to was an interview that I did with the writer Peter Hogan back in September of 2016. This was at the very beginning of the last narrative arc, The Man with No Name. That first issue had just come out. And so I invited Peter on the show just because I love this series so much. The thing I like about it is it's a really good kind of detective crime procedural kind of narrative given a science fiction twist, because if listeners aren't aware, the premise of Resident Alien is that someone from another world, and at times he's referred to on this world as Lord Pilot. So he is the sole pilot of a spaceship, comes to Earth in order to not so much to retrieve, but actually to destroy a research beacon that landed on Earth and went awry. Now, when he came to Earth, he was discovered by some kind of agency, and his ship was crippled. And in order for him to be undiscovered on this alien planet, Earth, he destroys his ship, not before setting off a beacon that he doesn't know if it will reach his people, but he hopes it will. So basically, he's been stranded on Earth for a while.
Right.
And he was trained to kind of keep away from humans, the native population, to go undercover, but he really can't. And so what he ends up doing, and you find this in the first narrative arc that was collected as Welcome to Earth, he settles in a place called Patience in the state of Washington. It's a small town, and he assumes the role of a doctor. Now, Patience's doctor, before he gets there, had recently passed, and so he takes on the role as a doctor, and because of his training as a pilot, his research, the advanced technological training that he is able to do some rudimentary medicine, so he can pass for a doctor. But he definitely looks like an alien. But the way that he masks himself is he has these alien, of course, powers that I guess you could describe it as hypnotizing individuals to make him seem human to others. Although when we read the comic, he definitely looks like an alien.
Right.
But to the people around him, or at least the vast majority of the people around him, he looks human just like anyone else. But to us, he has pointy ears, bald, a little on the purple side. There are certain humans on Earth that can see him for what he is. In other words, people on whom his hypnotic, if we want to call it, powers don't work. And one of those, and we don't see her as much in this first issue of the latest series, An Alien in New York, but she's quite a significant character in the earlier ones. Asta 12 Trees. And she ends up becoming, early on in this series, one of his assistants, one of his nurses that helps him out at the clinic. And Asta is of Native American origin. And so there's something about, and I want to talk about this, there's something, according to the creators, about her Native Americanness that allows her to get maybe little glimpses of who he actually is without being entirely sure. In the previous series, The Man with No Name, I think that's when we're introduced to Asta's father, Dan 12 Trees. And Dan, who comes across as almost a shaman-like character, definitely can see through his ruse. But he's okay with it. And because there's one point in The Man with No Name that he says to Harry, and that's the name that this alien is going by, Harry Vanderspiegel.
Right.
But Dan says to Harry, I know who you are. Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. And so they become friends because of this.
Right.
And so that's basically the setup. Now, the other part of this series, for those who may not be familiar with it, and I don't think you get this at all in the first issue of An Alien in New York. The one thing that threads all of these narrative arcs together is that certain governmental individuals or agencies are aware to some degree of this alien's presence on Earth. We don't know exactly how much they may know, or if I remember correctly, entirely exactly who these people are. But each of the narrative arcs, Welcome to Earth, Suicide Blonde, Sam Hain Mystery, Man with No Name, and now this latest one, are self-contained. And so in many ways, they're kind of like the old television detective shows, the procedurals, right? So this is like a science fiction Quincy.
Right.
Because he's a doctor. And so each narrative arc, which is like an episode, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But one of the things that threads all of these miniseries together is the fact that certain individuals or agencies are aware of his presence on Earth and slowly are getting closer, maybe, of finding out more about him.
Right. Yeah. 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 All that background that you said is helpful. And I guess I can report as a first-time reader of Resident Alien that much of it you can infer from the narrative itself. There's, that tiny bit of first page introductory exposition. But it's not lengthy at all. And so I think they did a good job. The creators did a good job in this first issue of orienting somebody. They're not fooling anybody that, we're already 5 arcs deep into this story. There's a lot that's building on past things. And so hopefully it didn't feel to you tiresome to rehearse some of these, sort of flashbacks and stuff like that. But for me as a new reader, it wasn't too disorienting. Like I caught on pretty quick to the idea that there are people who can see through his disguise or his ruse or whatever. In fact, they allude to that in one of the flashback scenes where one of his alien compadres is telling him that, 1 in a million are going to be able to see through this. And then he starts to question whether that 1 in a million is in fact as rare as it seems, because it seems like they all seem to, it's like a comedian. There's a comedian who said, Lincoln said that, you can't please all the people all the time, and tonight all those people are at my show. But so apparently he seems to be drawing these people who can see through him. But I think that's where the setup of this issue, which is that he's following a mystery, which is not really introduced until towards the end. He's following a mystery, and he's going to be in New York, really becomes kind of something interesting because, I assume that part of this is that he's in a fairly remote place. And so the crowdedness of Manhattan and how much he will be at risk of exposure and so on is maybe part of the tension that's introduced with this story arc. But anyway, yeah, all that read fairly clearly to me, and I'm kind of intrigued now. I have to go back and and pick up the previous 4 arcs because I like the way that they mash the sort of alien sci-fi and the detective mystery things going on here.
And it's interesting to hear your response, this being your very first Resident Alien issue, in that you picked up on those things fairly well because you're more attuned, I think, to the various strategies that Peter Hogan, along with Steve Parkhouse, have employed in getting new readers, so to speak, caught up with what Resident Alien is all about without being too heavy-handed with the exposition.
Right.
So there's certain things that you could get. Other things, though, you may not pick up on without having read the previous series, but that's okay. They're not really necessary. And I'll give you a couple examples. These are from the very beginning. Now, I don't know, maybe it's about 3 or 4 pages in is when we first see Harry, the alien doctor, and he comes in and says good morning to his assistants, and he almost does what looks like a double take. He sees something, and then he looks at it again, and it's a child's drawing of him, the doctor, the town doctor, but the little girl, someone who's called Honey, has drawn a picture of him as this purple, pointy-eared alien type of character.
Right.
And so Harry's reaction is, oh, no. And then he says, what? And then the nurses say, oh, that's something that little Honey did. Isn't it cute that she drew you as some little weird creature? And he starts to get a little worried, but then he reasons, well, this is a child's drawing, so of course it's going to be quite a bit askew. Now, you can appreciate this scene without knowing that at the tail end of the last narrative arc, The Man with No Name, Honey drew this. And the parents were going to give it to the doc in order to put up in his office, which is what the nurses actually did. And so this is Harry's first time seeing this. But that tells us also something, not only is this scene a way of linking one of the narrative arcs to the other in a subtle way, but I think nonetheless effective, but it also tells us something about the kind of people, that 1 in a million who is able to kind of skirt his hypnotic abilities. Young children. Many people say that, kids can see through a lot of the adult BS that's out there.
Yes.
Well, this is an example of that.
Right.
Another instance in this issue toward the beginning that I think if you knew the previous storylines, you would appreciate it more, but you don't need to in order to understand what's going on with this new narrative arc. This first issue opens with Asta and a character name is Download getting out of bed. They just had a drunken night together, made love, and she's leaving and saying, this is a mistake. Let's quit while we're ahead. And Download is saying, what, you didn't like it? Wasn't it like old times? And so you get hints that there's something about their past where they were involved in some way. Now, it's like, who is this Download character? Well, Download is a character that I think was introduced first in the last narrative arc, The Man with No Name. And he's someone who may seem kind of, a little unruly and nefarious. But he nonetheless is someone who can, at least in the last narrative arc, Man with No Name, help the authorities. He has a connection to the criminal world, but he's not necessarily, from what I can remember, an embedded part of it, right?
Got it. Okay.
So you don't need to know who Download is in order to appreciate this first issue, but knowing a little bit of his backstory and then knowing a little bit about who Asta is, because we don't see much of her in this first issue, but she is an important character in the resident alien world.
Right. Yeah. That's all helpful to hear. And you're right, actually. And I should be more transparent here that I said that it was relatively easy to infer those main details, but I think I read this fully knowing that this is the fifth story, and if somebody else was picking it up, not having read, I think that they would feel pretty lost. And I felt pretty lost actually initially as well with, for instance, that a little bit that you explained about the drawing on the wall. It actually helped to bring me into the idea that some people can see him and other people, but how exactly that worked, that the kid could see him as he is, but the others, who worked in the office didn't, and so on. I couldn't quite get that, couldn't quite grok all that. And so, I think, I don't want to give off the illusion that a person diving into this cold is going to be like instantly and immediately caught on to everything. But it does raise, I think, the challenge, which is a pretty high degree of difficulty for the creators, that this is something serial, but in miniseries, and this is something that, of course, like, Dark Horse and other publishers are doing, which is very canny, I think, to break things up into, rather than, one long continuous series with multiple arcs, so that this is an issue 25 or whatever, but to have a bunch of short arcs, and to give sort of more entry points in that way. But it's a high degree of difficulty for creators to want to keep building out a story that builds on previous stories and yet still retain the sort of individual seriality of each storyline, of each arc. That's a challenge, that's a challenge. And so, and as well as doing what they're doing in the kind of genre mashup. I know, Gene mentioned on the last previews episode that, it seemed to him like there were more and more of these pitches that were essentially like this genre mashed with that genre. I don't know if that's more frequent. It does seem to be what comics are trafficking in a lot these days. But I think, it seems like Resident Alien is doing that pretty effectively, at juggling those multiple imperatives pretty effectively. And so, that makes me kind of enthusiastic that there's, some backstory for me to dig into. Yeah.
And, other things about this first issue, in the last half, we see Harry, the alien doctor, at the bowling alley with some of his friends. They have a bowling team, and the two most prominent friends of his are Mike and Bert. Now, Mike is the town mayor and Bert is the police chief. Now, you really don't get that.
Right.
Their role in the community in this first issue.
Right.
It's much more significant, those roles, those characters, in the previous series. But again, you don't need to know this yet. But one of the functions, I think, of this bowling alley scene is this is where Harry tells his friends Bert and Mike that he's going to be leaving town for a while to take a little vacation. And the reason that he's leaving town is he's a little creeped out that the young girl, Honey, drew him as an alien, and he gets a little paranoid, and he just thinks maybe, in fact, asked his father, the Native American Dan, 12 Trees, says maybe if you just get out of town for a while, you'll get a new perspective and you'll feel better about things. And so that's what he intends to do.
Yeah.
But then that eventually leads us to what happens at the very end of this issue that you alluded to earlier. And that's basically setting up the mysteries. I think the majority of this first issue is setup.
Right.
With degrees here and there of going back and referencing the previous narrative arcs.
Right.
But when Harry gets back from bowling and also delivering someone's baby at the bowling alley, that was unexpected, he comes back and his assistant Asta is there in the clinic, and she's just there just in case something comes up. And so she's almost half asleep watching TV, and there's a program on, I guess, a documentary or some kind of news show about an artist named Raoul Benoit who has gone missing.
Right.
And they watch this story, this little short documentary piece, and the documentarians show this artist's signature, which is more a series of images or characters than anything. It's definitely not English.
Symbols.
It's not language.
Right.
And so when Harry looks at that, he notices, wait a minute, those are numbers. But those are numbers in a language that I know and I recognize. And when he tells Asta, what he thinks he sees, she says, I think that might be a phone number in the New York area, thus taking us into this series title, An Alien in New York. So we know he's going to leave town. We know he's going to take some kind of quote unquote vacation. Where is he going to go? Where he can solve another mystery.
That's right. Yeah. And that brings us to, and I don't know if you and Peter Hogan talked about this in your interview, which actually I now remember that I listened to, but since I hadn't read any of Resident Alien, couldn't track with everything. But, as a genre mashup, both crime mystery detective stories, and the alien on our planet genres, tend to say a lot, tend to have a lot of the feeling of alienation. Right? Or the sense of alienation. And so to take that to the city is an interesting thing, because it reminds me of, well, I don't know, a lot of 70s cinema about being in the city and feeling very, very alone in the city. So that should be interesting. I think that it's kind of fun to think about this particular setup of characters happening in the heart of New York. Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you about your take on something that I kind of briefly mentioned, but said I wanted to come back to later, and that is the presence of Asta and her father Dan as Native Americans who can, through one degree or another, kind of see through Harry as an alien.
Right.
I like the series. Don't get me wrong. I really do enjoy Resident Alien. I think it's well written. I love the episodic nature of this. I love the aforementioned genre mashup that's going on here. And it does strike me as something that, with a particular twist, could make a, let's say, 1970s crime television series.
Right.
On the other hand, there's something about the reliance on Native American figures to see through into the true reality to what the natural world is all about that strikes me as, I don't know, suspicious, askew, a little too stereotypical, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel the same?
Yeah, absolutely. I got that from the sense from the first scene with 12 Trees. And even this, as you were pointing out earlier, the fact that there's maybe a specialness to who can see through the guys, including children. And this is not to say that what the creators are doing here is like infantilizing Native American cultures, more that they're trying to reverence this specialness, but even that can be kind of, cloying representation. You know what I mean? Like, that it's like the magical Negro, like, right. So I can see the problematic, dimension of that, particularly when those are all the characters of that background that exist, like, if there's a Native American characters, they have to be somehow, magical or whatever, right? So,
yeah. And so I think it's not, let's say, a big narrative crime. It's just potentially an annoying one at best. Now, I mean, I can understand a child being able to see through to the reality, right? Because, children can see things in ways that adults do not, all of that.
Right.
But when you assign a particular community, ethnic, national, what have you, certain characteristics that even though your intention may not be nefarious or negative in any way, it nonetheless kind of essentializes certain features of that group, or at least popular features, or what some people say is popular features of the group, in a way that's not necessarily productive, to say the least.
Right.
I know that, there are instances where not just Native Americans, but others have made fun of this essentializing of the Native American as being shamanistic, of tapping into the natural world. And of course, Blazing Saddles immediately comes to mind. But there are other writers, filmmakers, creators, what have you, who do something similar.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, and I don't think I brought this up with Peter Hogan when I interviewed him a couple of years ago, but I'm wondering if maybe the fact that Peter Hogan is from the UK, if that is to some degrees kind of feeding into his uses of Native Americanness in his story. And again, I don't think that this is definitely not a deal breaker for me, but I'm wondering if maybe if Hogan were a U.S. author more enmeshed in, let's say, the nuances of social politics with not just the Native American community, but other ethnic and racial communities here in the U.S., that he would write this in a different way? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and impossible to speculate about what's going on in the creators' heads and hearts, but it is written into the piece, right? So I think fair for us to ask questions and critique, and I think very fair for somebody to read this. And like you said, every reader is going to come at it through their own lenses. And I think it's very kind and fair of you to say, let's presume the best intentions. And yet if somebody else were to say, this is another example of the sort of settler colonizing of Native American representations in a way that is, I think you said at best annoying, but really at worst could be, kind of insidious. I wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't, object to somebody taking that position. But certainly these are not the only creators rendering these characters, these people this way, right? And so I take it as an ongoing and long and needed struggle to represent better when we talk about different communities.
Right.
Absolutely. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. I think that is needs to be noted as it is. Yeah.
All of that being said, I do feel that those who read not just this first issue, but even the previous issues and the other narrative arcs of Resident Alien will find that neither the character Dan 12trees or the more prominent daughter Asta 12trees in other ways are treated as stereotypical or essentialized in any way, or at least from my memory and from going back and rereading the way that these characters unfold in the stories. I really don't think that there's anything definitely about Asta that strikes me as essentially Native American or stereotypical in any way. I mean, she does seem to be, maybe not in this first issue, but throughout the whole range of stories in Resident Alien, quite a complex character and quite complicated. So, I think that this reliance on the world of like the magical natural world, connectedness with Native American culture is the only, if we want to call it, stereotyped approach to these characters. But other than that, though, I don't see a problem with the way that Hogan or even Parkhouse represent them.
Yeah. And I always want to be cautious talking about this. I mean, I'm a flaming Berkeley radical, but an ethnic studies guy. I also think that we, if we sort of reprimand every attempt at representation, then I think artists feel the need to say, oh, all right, well, I'm trying to have a diverse cast, and every time I do, then blah, blah, blah. I just think that, we should be applauded for what's, praiseworthy, and we should keep also pushing ourselves to do better and better, So, right. and not having read the previous stuff, I really am not in any position to judge. I'm just kind of commenting on, the idea generally that, that you can have that kind of representation. So yeah, I think that, from what I can see of Dan 12trees, there's potentially something that might bother me, and that's all I'm ready to say, because I haven't read enough to really fairly assess, but also recognizing that I don't think that putting a character like that into the book means that we all have to be immediately up in arms or immediately write off creators.
Yeah. I've said this many times on the show. This is a good series that I highly recommend. But, I'll tell you what made me think even more of, I guess, Hogan's use of Native Americanness in this, and how him not being a U.S. writer may have something to do with this. This came home to me when I was preparing for this episode. I went back to reread the previous narrative arc, The Man with No Name. And at one point in one of the issues, a character, a U.S., someone who's definitely American from the United States, living in the state of Washington, says to someone, I can't remember their exact words, but they use a collective noun in a plural manner. And one of the differences between U.S. and U.K. English is that with collective nouns like group, the British speaker will refer to group as plural. Say the group took their, whereas their time doing something. Whereas an American speaker of English will say the group took its time, so it's singular. That's right. In one of those issues from the previous narrative arc, the collective noun was used with plural verb or pronoun. Yeah. So, and that tells me that, that's something editors should have caught, unless the editor's British. Okay.
Same, right?
Yeah. But, and so I thought, if that came through, and it's clear that, Hogan is not an American writer, that kind of seeped through. I'm wondering if other things, other predispositions, other, let's say, views from across the pond, so to speak, may have come through in the writing of Resident Alien. But again, I think that this is a very minor issue. It's definitely not a deal breaker for me. And in fact, I'm intrigued by everything that we see in Resident Alien, this issue and otherwise.
Yeah. There's a lot packed into this. I mean, there's some stuff about art here and sort of a Banksy-like character. There's the small town bowling. There's just a lot packed into this issue, and it makes me think that this is a very elaborately drawn world. And so, again, I am interested to go back and deepen my Resident Alien knowledge.
There you go. Our week's discussion of 3 recent comics. We started off with Anna Haifisch's Von Spatz. After that, we looked at Skyward #1 by Joe Henderson and Lee Garbett. And then we wrapped up by looking at the first issue of the latest Resident Alien narrative arc, Resident Alien, An Alien in New York by Peter Hogan and Steve Parkhouse. 3 good titles.
Yeah, absolutely. All ones that you should check out, maybe in some different ways. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And we know where you can check these things out, and at great discounts. It's Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a variety of titles at incredible discounts, including the latest issues of Skyward and Resident Alien and Alien in New York that are available right now if you go to dcbservice.com. You can also find Von Spatz at a great discount. And after you do get those titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us through the old-fashioned email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. Individually, if you want to encourage Derek for his amazing work, he's at derek@comicsalternative.com. If you want to correct my various verbal gaffes, I'm at paul@comicsalternative.com. And we're also all over social media. And Derek, you can tell us about how to find Comics Alternative there.
Yeah, you can get in touch with us on a variety of different outlets such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we occasionally post on the blog, simply by going to the website comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And don't forget that you can also support us on Patreon. We're going to be doing some revamping of that pretty soon. But meanwhile, you can still check us out there. Derek, thanks. This has been fun.
Yeah, and we will be back next week with more comics fun. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, signing off.
Hey, what happened?